Good morning, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Dwight Bashir, and I'm Director of Outreach and Policy for the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, or USCIRF. USCIRF is an independent, bipartisan government body created over 20 years ago by the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998. Our mandate is to monitor freedom of religion or belief abroad and to make policy recommendations to the President, Secretary of State, and Congress. Today's event corresponds with our launch of a commission report on anti-Semitism in several European member states of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. I'm joined today by two of our commissioners, USCIRF's chair, Gayle Manchin, and USCIRF Commissioner Gary Bauer. We're also joined by two expert panelists from the Anti-Defamation League, Director of European Affairs Andrew Srulevitch, and the ADL's Washington Director for International Affairs David Weinberg. The event today will begin with opening remarks from Chair Manchin and Commissioner Bauer, and then we will hear from Andrew Srulevitch and David Weinberg, the two primary authors of the report we're releasing today. Afterwards, I'll moderate a brief conversation among the speakers with a couple of opening questions. And then following that, there'll be time for questions from the audience. Now, to ask a question, please use the Zoom webinar Q&A function at the bottom center of your screen to submit your question in writing, which you can do at any time starting now. It's now my pleasure to turn the floor over to Chair Manchin.
Thank you, Dwight, and a special thank you to my fellow panelists and actually everyone that has tuned in and taken the time to join us today. As you know, we issue an annual report which covers our findings and recommendations on the countries that we find to be the worst religious freedom violators globally. The launch of that report is set for a week from today, April the 21st. So please mark your calendars and plan to tune in and join us for that. In addition, we issue publications throughout the year on a variety of countries and issues related to international religious freedom, as well as operate two programs related to religious prisoners of conscience. A key component of the Commission's activities is the documentation of global anti-Semitism. I know I speak for all the commissioners when I say we are very concerned about the rise in Jew hatred over the last 2 decades. In 2020, USCIRF held 2 events related to anti-Semitism, a hearing in January regarding worldwide efforts to combat anti-Semitism, and a conversation in September which focused on anti-Semitism, specifically in Europe, in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. The testimony that panelists delivered in January hearing motivated us to seek more information. We sought to enhance institutional understanding of the phenomena of anti-Semitism in European countries and the government responses to it, in order to make specific and effective recommendations for U.S. policy. Our priorities were threefold. First, an examination of the diverse manifestations of anti-Jewish hatred in each country of research. Second, an analysis of each government's response to anti-Semitism in their country. And third, a review of how the U.S. policy apparatus has engaged with the situation of Jews in these countries and any recommendations for improved action by the U.S. government to address this issue. I am proud to say that the report we are launching today, it's titled Anti-Semitism in Europe, Implications for U.S. Policy, addresses each of these priorities, and I hold it up for review there. The report, as a result of many months of research and analysis conducted by the Anti-Defamation League, a world-renowned organization at the forefront of combating anti-Semitism since 1913. The researchers you will hear from today conducted numerous interviews In the 11 countries examined, including with Jewish community leaders in the 11 countries, and also government officials, as well as several current and former US policymakers. These interviews and the analysis of multinational surveys on anti-Semitism from recent years factor into a concise, comprehensive study of anti-Semitism and what the US government can do to combat it. And now it is a pleasure to turn the floor over to Commissioner Gary Bauer to provide a glimpse into the anti-Semitic trends that USCIRF followed during 2020.
Thank you, Chair Manchin. I want to begin by echoing your thanks to Andrew and David for joining us here today. And I want to express my gratitude to both of them for their outstanding report. I know this is a resource that USCIRF will be able to utilize for years to come as we push the US government to do more to combat Jew hatred. And make no mistake about it, our government must do more. Before I turn over this session to our guests to present the findings, I'd like to put the conversation we're having in the context of global anti-Semitism and the adversities that Jews have faced over the last year. Sadly, 2020 was another difficult year for the global Jewish community. First and foremost, the COVID-19 pandemic unleashed another avalanche of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, peddled in the centuries-old stereotypes, blaming the international health crisis on Jews in Israel. It's unbelievable. The irrational claims grew so severe that the US Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief, Ahmad Shahid, said that he was extremely concerned to see that certain religious leaders and politicians continue to exploit the challenging times during this pandemic to once again spread hatred against Jews. Beyond the pandemic, there were a lot of incidents that were cause for concern. In October, USCIRF issued a fact sheet on the importance of ritual slaughter to Jewish individuals who want to teach the following of their faith, the rules of their faith on dietary laws. Yet the Court of Justice of the European Union ruled in December that member countries may ban the practice of ritual slaughter in order to promote animal welfare. This raises the danger of endangering the ability of Jews across the continent to access kosher meat. Physical attacks against Jewish individuals, families, and institutions occurred around the world in 2020, sadly, even here in the United States. Jewish cemeteries, think about this a second, even dead Jews were not allowed to rest in peace. Jewish cemeteries were frequent targets for acts of vandalism, including spray-painted Nazi rhetoric and imagery, smashed headstones and stolen property. Greece and Spain particularly had this problem. Jews were refused service because of their faith in countries including Britain and France. Textbooks in countries whose governments profess Islam as an official religion continued to contain anti-Semitic content. Nothing like teaching the rising generation to hate. I know, David, you're familiar with this trend and this phenomenon. In Poland, this year's presidential election featured anti-Semitic themes openly promulgated by members of one of the political parties. And a chilling incident in the Ukraine, a high-ranking police official requested a list of all Jews living in a particular city. Disturbingly, we've also seen an uncovering of far-right extremism and neo-Nazism within the ranks of Germany's military and police institutions, which no doubt figure into the information contained in today's featured report. With all these incidents in mind, I'm greatly looking forward to the remarks from our panelists. As I said in our event last fall, anti-Semitism is among the most important issues that we cover here at the Commission. And I am unwavering in my conviction that anti-Semitism must be rooted out anywhere it rears its ugly head, on the radical right, the radical left, and anti-Semitism, even in the Christian church. No matter what side of the political or ideological spectrum, it must be exposed and rooted out. I'll now turn it over to Andrew to give an overview of the new report and an assessment of the various degrees to which European countries combat anti-Semitism within their own borders.
Thank you, Commissioner Bauer, and thank you, Chair Manchin, and all of the USCIRF commissioners for the opportunity to work with USCIRF on this report. I'd also like to thank the wonderful USCIRF staff who provided guidance and support throughout the process of producing the report. So the research questions we posed are whether Jews can live openly and freely in Europe, and where they can't, why not? And what are their governments doing to address those problems? And finally, what can the US government do to help the fight against anti-Semitism in Europe? And my co-author, David Weinberg, will speak to that last point in a few minutes. Now, anti-Semitism in Europe is unfortunately a very broad and deep topic, and we don't claim to have done an exhaustive report on it. Our goal really was to highlight the major problems, provide a top-line assessment of European government actions, and make recommendations for US policymakers. Now, we chose 11 countries for this study. They were Belgium, France, Germany, Hungary, the Netherlands, Norway, Poland, Russia, Sweden, Ukraine, and the United Kingdom. 9 of them have major European Jewish communities, and 2, Norway and Poland, have smaller communities, but they present really interesting case studies. So as was mentioned, for the research, we interviewed Jewish community leaders in each country and government representatives, and we used a standard questionnaire for each group. Now, then those interviews were complemented by desk research to develop profiles of how anti-Semitism manifests in each country and how governments are addressing anti-Semitism. So the main factors we looked at were first, the prevalence of anti-Semitic attitudes among the general population, which we measured with ADL's Global 100 survey of anti-Semitic attitudes. The second factor is the number and nature, kind of severity, of anti-Semitic incidents. The third factor was tolerance for anti-Semitic rhetoric in public, or talk about sort of the public square, whether it be in politics or in media. And then the fourth factor was actions or inaction by governments to counter and prevent anti-Semitism. And that last category of government action includes things like providing physical security for Jewish institutions, public denunciations of anti-Semitism by political leaders, prosecution of anti-Semitic hate crimes, and education against anti-Semitism. So we put all that information together for each of the 11 countries, and those country profiles constitute the first part of the report. Now, in the second part, we analyzed the research findings and made assessments of the categories that we judged as most significant. Now, those 5 categories are first, political commitment, and then second, physical security measures, third, education about anti-Semitism, fourth, incident reporting, and then fifth is law enforcement. And we found that the states covered in this report have mixed records across these major categories. So what I'm going to do now is just go over the top line findings for each of those categories. First, political commitment. Now, political commitments to combat anti-Semitism were made by every state covered in this report in 2004, in the 2004 Berlin Declaration of the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE. And it was repeated several times in that OSCE context. Now, the member states of the European Union, many of which were covered, also have made multiple declarations in the context of the European Union. Now, where do we see political commitment? We see it's evident to tackle anti-Semitism where political leaders regularly, publicly condemn anti-Semitic attitudes. We see it when they confer with Jewish leaders on plans of action. We see it where governments have put in place national plans against anti-Semitism and assigned national coordinators for those plans. Such steps ensure that efforts are made across government, putting emphasis on the most pressing issues and assuring that gaps are filled. So among the exemplary governments in this respect, in terms of political commitment, are France, Germany, Norway, Sweden, and the UK. Next, physical security. Here, with the exception of France, all Jewish community leaders responded that the physical security measures at Jewish institutions were adequate to the threats assessed. But their most common complaint was that Jewish communities bore excessive financial burdens for necessary security measures, such as private security guards. However, there were several governments that covered all or a vast majority of security costs, including Hungary, Norway, and the UK. Now, the third is education. The common and lamentable problem in this category is the absence of formal education about anti-Semitism outside the context of the Holocaust. Now, a repeated complaint from Jewish community leaders was that history textbooks included references to Jews only in the context of biblical Israel, the Holocaust, and then the modern state of Israel. And largely absent were positive representations of Jewish contributions to national and world society. And Jewish leaders have long called for more positive examples to be taught as a means of dispelling anti-Semitic stereotypes of Jews as separate from and even parasitic on the rest of society and somehow concerned only with themselves. So the fourth major category we looked at was incident reporting. Now, anti-Semitic incident reporting should be systematic, public, informative, and actionable for policymakers. And unfortunately, in too many cases, it's not. Among the 11 states in this study, there were wide differences in the methods of data collection for anti-Semitic incidents, even in the more restrictive cases of anti-Semitic hate crime. And again, differences in categorization. So for example, Germany records what they call politically motivated crimes with an anti-Semitic motive, unquote, which in practice it treats as essentially only right-wing extremist hate crimes. While in the Netherlands, they record what they call, quote, discriminatory anti-Semitic incidents, unquote. So that captures a much broader array of data. Now, categorization also differs widely, which affects the utility of the information collected. So in the UK and France, for example, incident categories are clear and comprehensive. While in Poland, 89% of reported anti-Semitic incidents were categorized as unspecified. Now, proper categorization is imperative because different types of incidents will require different policy responses. Vandalism may require more visible security measures, such as noticeable cameras or security personnel. High numbers of assaults may dictate mobile police patrols within a certain perimeter of Jewish institutions. And illegal online hate speech may dictate more police resources for investigations or to liaise with social media platforms or in other areas. The other thing when we look at incident reporting is you have to remember there is massive underreporting by victims of incidents. We know this from a survey that was done by the European Agency for Fundamental Rights in 2019, where members of Jewish communities were asked whether they had reported, either to the police or to some other organization, the most serious anti-Semitic incident that had occurred over the past 5 years. And in every country, the vast majority of victims had not reported the incident, ranging from 88% in Hungary to 74% in the Netherlands, with most of the 8 countries in between surveyed at around 80%. Finally, law enforcement, the last category. Jewish leaders were asked whether anti-Semitic crimes were adequately prosecuted as hate crimes, and the responses varied, including those who were generally satisfied, like in Sweden and the UK, those who were generally unsatisfied, France, Poland, Russia, and Ukraine, and those who noted that some progress was being made but more is needed, Belgium and the Netherlands, and those who noted that there were just too few cases to really make an assessment, and that was the answer in Hungary and Norway. Now, the 2 factors that were often cited for the less than satisfactory state of prosecutions were insufficient or inconsistent applications of penalty enhancements, meaning the crime was not charged with a greater penalty because it was a hate crime, an anti-Semitic hate crime. And then the second reason was difficulties in establishing motive based on the information collected. So our overall conclusions in terms of looking at Europe were the following: that measured against their own long-standing and common political commitments, governments of the 11 states covered have responded differently to the challenges of anti-Semitism in their countries. In some countries, anti-Semitic attitudes are a greater challenge than anti-Semitic incidents. In others, the reverse holds true. But in 10 of the 11 countries, efforts seemed insufficient to meet the anti-Semitism challenges that present themselves. Now, in some cases, the insufficiency is due to other sort of more immediate problems in these countries. So, for example, in Russia and Ukraine, the Jewish leaders did not really assess anti-Semitism as such a serious concern among the issues facing the Jewish communities in general and facing their countries, that they didn't really fault their governments for a lack of effort against anti-Semitism. In some cases, such as Belgium and the Netherlands, Jewish leaders were worried that the political commitment was not commensurate with their assessments of the situation of anti-Semitism, with the result that government actions were judged insufficient. And in some cases, such as in France, Germany, and the UK, the governments have exhibited clear political will to tackle anti-Semitism. But here, perhaps the scale of the problem may just be exceeding their efforts. Now, only one government seems to be making the efforts that meet and even exceed the anti-Semitism challenges in their country, and that's Norway. Now, Norway has a very small Jewish community, only about 1,200 people, but we wanted to include it in this report because of the positive example it provides. In Norway, the government has ensured a comprehensive national plan, coordination with its Jewish community's leadership, fully financed security measures, detailed programs for educators, mandatory training on anti-Semitism for police, disaggregated hate crime reporting, meaning that they break out anti-Semitic hate crime and report on it, multifaceted monitoring of anti-Semitism in Norwegian society, and promotion of positive aspects of Jewish life through its Jewish Pathfinders program that sends Jewish students around the country to speak in classrooms about being Jewish in Norway. So before turning it over to David, I want to thank him for the great collaboration on this report, and also express my appreciation for the support of our ADL colleagues as we worked on it. And David, over to you.
But before David jumps in, sorry to interrupt you, David. I just want to remind the audience, please do submit your written questions. The Q&A tab at the bottom center of your screen. Feel free to start bringing those in as we anticipate after David will start the conversation. But David, back over to you.
Great. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and to USCIRF in particular for the strategic investment you clearly made in expanding your important work on combating anti-Semitism throughout recent years. So for the part 3 of this report, I conducted a range of deep background interviews with current and former US officials from both the congressional and the executive branches, and from both sides of the aisle, in order to get expert feedback on a not for attribution basis, so that participants could speak freely about how the US government can best help combat anti-Semitism in Europe. First and foremost, there was widespread bipartisan awareness that anti-Semitism is rising in many places around the world, including in many European countries, and that more can and should be done to combat it, and that doing so is in the US national interest. I also made sure to ask interview subjects explicitly about the alternative hypothesis, namely whether the US perhaps spends too much time or effort or tax dollars on combating anti-Semitism in Europe, yet not a single interview subject agreed with that supposition. And now, of course, that may be a matter of who chose to respond to interview requests or other forms of selection bias, but I still think it was worth asking and worth noting here. Generally speaking, the people I spoke to felt that the US can and should be doing more than it is already doing in this space, citing a variety of US interests that are advanced by such efforts, pointing out, for example, that anti-Semitism abroad threatens democracy or pluralism or stability in US allied countries, and to a lesser extent that it contributes to violent extremism more generally, or anti-Americanism, or violence against the state of Israel, another strategic US ally. There was also widespread agreement that the US can and should use its voice up to the most senior levels to call out anti-Semitism abroad and to encourage or commend positive steps to combat it. And that, while this is something that the US has done across administrations, that this is something that there's room to do more of. Additionally, there was clear feedback that calling in our friends in other countries' governments on these sorts of issues is important, but also that calling out problem governments on this issue publicly is important when the policies are being taken are clearly insufficient or problematic, even if those governments are US allies that have close relationships here in Washington. Relatedly, many interview subjects expressed concern that this widespread support for combating anti-Semitism in principle may not necessarily translate into widespread understanding and practice of how anti-Semitism manifests in various forms and how to best identify it. Now, with regard to particular officials and offices in the US government, there was widespread agreement about the importance and increasing impact of the Office of the US Special Envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism, which is poised to be more impactful than ever once it is fully staffed again as well. The office is set to have double the budget this fiscal year than ever before, thanks to congressional appropriators, as well as greater authorities due to a new law passed on an overwhelming bipartisan basis at the very end of 2020. There was also clear consensus that filling this office swiftly and staffing it fully is crucial, which now includes both nominating and the Senate confirming the next envoy. And respondents felt that bipartisan support for the work and for the funding of this office requires it to steer clear of domestic or partisan issues across administrations. We also heard two very interesting ideas for this office going forward, and for ways to spend some of its increased appropriated funding. One was to potentially reboot the office's original annual reports on anti-Semitism abroad. And the other was to expand the office's career staff, including to expand its focus on internal State Department processes, coordination, and messaging, in order to generate, for example, a how-to manual for new foreign service officers in country, as well as to advise regional and functional bureaus on generating potentially biannual strategies on combating anti-Semitism in their space, as well as to translate the department's policy pronouncements, for example, from the secretary's level, into operational guidance on how to combat anti-Semitism in practice for various bureaus. The report also identifies an array of other US government offices that play an important role in the fight against anti-Semitism in Europe in various ways. as noted in the report, for example. Also some ways that some of these can do more with additional targeted funding. Most notably, that includes speaking out on anti-Semitism by the president and the vice president themselves, as well as the National Security Council, the Secretary of State, and an array of other State Department offices, including the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor and its Assistant Secretary, the Office of International Religious Freedom and its Ambassador at Large, the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs, the Special Envoy for Holocaust Issues in that bureau, and the Special Representative to Muslim Communities that could be rebooted at the department. Like USCIRF, it's important to note the International Religious Freedom team at State is most immediately relevant as a partner on a specific subset of issues related to anti-Semitism in Europe, such as when laws restricting kosher animal slaughter or ritual male circumcision are under consideration in specific countries or municipalities. But they also have an important role combating anti-Semitism much more broadly, since being able to pray, attend communal institutions, or wear ritual religious clothing in public without fear of harm are all core religious freedom issues and under threat in many nations. Also of note is the Commission for Preservation of America's Heritage Abroad, which could play a more consistent role calling out cases of vandalism at religious heritage sites in Europe and Eurasia, such as synagogues or other houses of worship, as well as cemeteries, if the Commission receives sufficient funding for a dedicated staffer focused on monitoring and reporting such incidents. And now, Congress. The Senate's creation of a bipartisan task force for combating anti-Semitism in the last year or two, following the House's precedent, is an important step. For example, when Polish state media incited anti-Semitism in the last election there, the executive branch wouldn't really vocally call that out, but a bipartisan letter from the Senate task force's co-chairs did, sending an important bipartisan message. Creating a funded Senate bipartisan human rights task force along the lines of the Lantos Commission in the House can also help, as does the Helsinki Commission's ongoing crucial work. Additionally, interparliamentary commissions and fora play an important role, including through the OSCE, the European Union, NATO, the Council of Jewish Parliamentarians, and the new Interparliamentary Task Force on Online Anti-Semitism. And while both sides of the aisle occasionally face strong incentives to paint either the fringes or the leaders on the other side of the aisle as anti-Semites or soft on anti-Semitism, the more that congressional leaders can eschew that temptation, generally speaking, the better, since doing so poses a risk of potentially chipping away at the public legitimacy of identifying and fighting anti-Semitism abroad. Finally, I just want to note some thematic goals from the report as well, including areas where the US can help weigh in regarding security, anti-Semitism coordinators, the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, education, cyber hate, and multilateral institutions. First, security. It's clear that the US government cannot be responsible for funding the security of European Jewish communities, but it can call on European governments to do so appropriately. It can provide training and advise on best practices, for example, to law enforcement or judiciaries. And the US can also coordinate in the counterterrorism and countering violent extremism space. For example, against extremists of any kind that slander and attack Jewish communities in Europe. Second, anti-Semitism coordinators. The US should be urging every European government, if it doesn't have one, to appoint an authoritative anti-Semitism coordinator, specifically with an internal focus, not a foreign ministry position, for example, so that these coordinators can be the primary address for addressing anti-Semitism and particularly anti-Semitic incidents and responding to the challenge internally in an effective way. Additionally, these coordinators should be focused solely on anti-Semitism, not all forms of hate, given the history and current severity of this problem across most of Europe and Eurasia. And additionally, This is not to preclude the importance, for example, of coordinators addressing other forms of hate, either individually or generally, or collectively, but just sort of given the nature of the severity of the anti-Semitism problem, we think this specific focus is important. Third, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism frequently came up in interviews as a useful tool for identifying anti-Semitism when it manifests, and that it should be embraced, but in a judicious manner, by governments in Europe in order to avoid validating unfair criticisms of the working definition, claiming that it's aimed at, say, silencing protected pro-Palestinian speech, which is not the purpose of the definition. Fourth, education. The report lists an array of steps that particular US agencies or offices can and should take to step up support for anti-Semitism education in European countries, as well as Holocaust education and anti-bias education more generally, as well as public awareness initiatives to raise similar awareness among adults in Europe in partnership with foreign governments and local civil society. Fifth, anti-Semitic cyber hate is a sprawling, deeply dangerous problem that is under-addressed by platforms as well as under-regulated. Much more needs to be done to motivate and advise enforcement actions as well as counter-messaging. And then lastly, multilateral organizations. For example, the US can do more to bolster the effectiveness of the United Nations' new focal point for combating all forms of anti-Semitism, as well as pressing UN bodies such as the UN Human Rights Council to mitigate its problematic, disproportionate approach on Israel. And there's also the nascent US-chartered International Alliance for Freedom of Religion or Belief that can be consolidated to play an important role on all kinds of freedom of religion or belief, as well, including supporting vulnerable faith communities, such as Jewish communities in Europe. And then lastly, there's the OSCE itself. We found that the US should fund a revitalization of the OSCE's Words into Action program against anti-Semitism, including pushing for an expanded series of national action assessment reports on anti-Semitism to provide recommendations specified for each OSCE participating state relative to their pledges. And then lastly, the US should pressure and support all OSCE participating states to finally follow through on their basic commitment to provide meaningful hate crimes data to the OSCE, since most do not even report the number of anti-Semitic hate crimes each year to the organization. That seems like one of the absolute minimum steps that all OSCE participating states should be held accountable for following through on, and an area where the US would be on very solid grounds to push on to ensure governments are tracking and better able to address threats to sustaining their Jewish communities that face resurgent anti-Semitism.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Andrew, for sharing, giving us a glimpse of your findings and of the plethora of policy recommendations. Let me just throw two questions out one to each of you before we turn to the audience questions. And a final reminder, use that Q&A function, bottom center of your screen. Go ahead and submit your questions. One of the aspects of the report, Andrew, that we're very interested in is the disparate anti-Semitic incidents reporting standards among the 11 countries. You talked about the massive underreporting in some countries, that proper categorization of these incidents is critical for understanding the root causes of and prevention strategies of these hate crimes. Now, even though the OSCE, I believe, has issued guidance very clear on how to develop robust collection and reporting processes for hate crimes, do you have a sense of why some of these countries have been so slow or unwilling to improve their reporting standards? And then, David, just to hone in a bit, with the new administration coming in here in the US, what would you consider priority recommendations as far as things that the new administration should focus on to cooperate and support Europe in its efforts to combat anti-Semitism, if you had to really raise some of those? So I'll start. Andrew, why don't you start with the first response?
Sure, thank you, Dwight. I don't have a good answer for you on why they haven't done this. I will say, first of all, that criminal justice is at the members in the European Union, is at a member state competency. It's not at the EU level. So each state has, devises its own solutions on that. But I will tell you that this is one of the most important issues, because we know, for example, I mentioned that there's this massive underreporting, but I'll give you two examples of two countries where we think it's going in different directions. In the UK, they actually do have a higher number, a very high number, I would say, of anti-Semitic incidents that are reported to the Community Security Organization, which is called CST, or the Community Security Trust. They've shown increasing numbers of incidents over the years, and we think that some of that is due to more reporting, because the British Jewish organizations have been very good about encouraging their community to be sure to report incidents so that they can make sure that it gets the attention that it deserves, both from law enforcement and from government. So while they have been increasing incidents, and in one sense, it makes the community not look so good, it's again, a sort of step in the right direction. The counterexamples in France, also high numbers of incidents, but actually, even though it has a larger community on a per capita basis, they seem to have fewer incidents than in the UK. But it's really not what you would intuit from hearing, the news stories or reading the news stories about that. And it's because you'll hear from French Jewish leaders, there's this fatigue about reporting, that they don't feel that often that the reports are treated seriously, that they're not getting results. And so that leads to less reporting. And that's a trap we really have to make sure to avoid, because when you have that lack of confidence in law enforcement, that's a critical issue that needs to be addressed.
Thank you, David.
Yeah. So I think the use of voice is something that this administration has already been doing on this issue pretty significantly. But I think the next two sort of most pressing issues are funding and staffing for these sorts of things, right? I mean, the Anti-Semitism Envoy Office has unprecedented levels of funding. Will it be able to spend it? Does it have the staff to do so? And will the administration issued a skinny budget, which understandably is about top line items and not about sort of some of the more particular levels at different offices and budgets and initiatives across various departments. But I think when it comes to what does Congress hear from the executive branch about where they want to see spending happen, and also just as an administration is staffing up, right? Every administration faces challenges in terms of getting the senior level principals in place and getting more than just 3 or 4 people confirmed per agency in the first couple of months, right? That's standard. I think one of the things that's truly exceptional right now is the scope of the challenge, right? The anti-Semitic scapegoating and conspiracy theories that you noted, Commissioner Bauer, specifically related to the coronavirus, are a really, really serious problem right now. And especially as lockdowns are ending in many of these countries, but disinformation and cyber hate related to this issue has been truly severe, plus economic crises, right? The economic fallout from this global public health crisis has been truly severe and truly felt around the globe. And the temptation for political leaders to scapegoat or for opportunities for extremist movements to do so, which can then lead to physical world violence as well. I think we're really poised for a serious problem over the coming year in this regard. And so the more the US government can be poised to really take steps to try and preclude that, I think the better.
Thank you both. Before we turn to the audience, I wanted to double check and see if Chair Manchin or Commissioner Bauer wanted to either ask a question or make a comment at this point before we turn to our audience members.
If I could just make a brief comment, You know, one can get quite depressed and demoralized seeing the enduring nature of anti-Semitism over thousands of years. You can also take some heart, however, I know I do, when I see that the civilizations that were most known for their oppression of the Jewish people are long gone. We could go through a whole list. You know, the 1,000-year Reich barely lasted 10 years. So while anti-Semitism is a horrible evil, it is also encouraging that the nations that have most engaged in it through the millennium are long gone, and yet the Jewish people endure. And obviously our hope at USCIRF is that reports like this will help the Jewish people endure through whatever may come down the road.
Gary, you are so right. And my sort of comment builds on what you just said, but I'm wondering, with the work that you did, Andrew and David, and in talking with the legal authorities in these countries, and also people that are filing reports, do you think that in and of itself is making a difference, calling attention to it, bringing it more to the surface, more awareness of what is going on? Do you believe that at the end of the day, that it will make a difference?
I think it's a critical question. I think absolutely it will make a difference, because if we look at the situation from the point of view of a member of the Jewish community living in one of these countries, again, the amount of police attention to a certain area, the amount of security funding, the amount of political attention given when there are incidents, all of this depends on the assessments of the level of the problem. And so without the data, we're not going to have the policy. Without the right data, we're not going to have the right policy. And that's why I really tried to underscore before one of the worrying things in France is I think this lack of reporting of even violent incidents. Because again, I really try to look at the situation from the point of view of a Jew in Europe, and violence, anti-Semitic hate crime is really the key issue. Much more important than whether a government has adopted the IRA definition, hasn't adopted the IRA definition. If you feel insecure and your friends and neighbors in your community also feel insecure, and you feel insecure about them, that's going to be the critical issue about the survival of Jewish communities in Europe. So that's why I think it's really, really at the heart of the matter.
Great, thank you. Let me now turn to audience questions. The first one has to do with something that was touched on, but asking, are there attempts in Europe to get a more unified reporting on anti-Semitic incidents using the now more widely accepted International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's working definition? I know there was reference to that, but is there any entity that's working to really, you said it was beneficial, but is there any entity working to kind of make that happen so that we have more kind of consensus around that?
Well, first, I think it's important to differentiate when we're talking about reporting between anti-Semitic incidents and anti-Semitic hate crimes, because incidents are not necessarily going to be reported to the police. And obviously hate crimes are more severe and more impactful, again, both on the individual and on the community itself. So there have been efforts to standardize the hate crime reporting, as David referenced, in terms of the OSCE context. For incidents, I think, it's generally governments are not recording incidents. Those are mostly civil society organizations, equivalents to ADL in different countries, or the Jewish communities themselves, which are trying to record incidents. And I think the IRA definition, which was adopted by the Council of the European Union, which is the grouping of the member states themselves, of the governments themselves. It was adopted in that sense in December 2018. And the real issue now in terms of the anti-Semitic hate crimes is getting that definition pushed down through the law enforcement bureaucracy so that it is applied at the essential reporting level, at the precinct level, to have the proper classification of whether an incident, or in this case a hate crime, is an anti-Semitic hate crime or not. And so that's really the big, even the countries with the most political will right now, where they're at is at the level of trying to push this down through the bureaucracy, through the law enforcement bureaucracy.
And if I could add something on there, I think the IRA definition and some of the controversies related to it partly go to the question of what is a crime and what is anti-Semitic. And so the IRA definition itself notes that criticism of Israel per se is not anti-Semitic, and that statements that are, or actions that are anti-Semitic are not necessarily an anti-Semitic hate crime, depending on law in various jurisdictions. And so it's important to note that helping local law enforcement understand how to appropriately apply it does not mean that saying, Zionists are bad is a hate crime, right? But it does mean that if you torch a synagogue and you say, die Zionists, right? That the word Zionist is not a political statement solely in that context, but rather is also an indication of intent of that fire, and that it's not just necessarily an apolitical instance of vandalism or a protected international political statement.
Thank you. Next question has to do with what plans are there to mobilize faith leaders from the highest levels to grassroots to unite and address this issue together through advocacy and education? If you could elaborate on some of what you found in that area.
Andrew, do you want to, shall I?
I'll just say one aspect of that. I think the area where there is the greatest potential for sort of interfaith advocacy is adjacent to the anti-Semitism question, but really is core to USCIRF, is the religious freedom question, particularly on newborn circumcision and meat slaughter for kosher or halal. And there you have a very clear coincidence of interests between Jewish communities and Muslim communities in Europe on both of these questions. They're not identical, but they're similar enough, and both communities are threatened by campaigns, largely I would call radical secularist campaigns, to ban circumcision and non-stunned slaughter, the ritual slaughter for animals. So that's where I think there's the greatest opportunity. David?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And it's something that came up a lot in the interviews, where it's clear that a lot of people in the space really find great value in coalition nature work, either be it, say, bringing together representatives of different communities in European countries, which our embassies do, or in terms of US officials responsible for different portfolios, for example, the anti-Semitism envoy and the then special rep for Muslim communities positions traveling jointly. Say I think there was a case where they traveled to Sweden and brought together Muslim and Jewish and Christian faith leaders for the first time in one of the major Swedish cities on these issues of standing up against all forms of hate, including anti-Muslim bigotry and anti-Jewish bigotry. And that this is really helpful for helping build coalitions in a way that some of these communities and societies aren't necessarily doing in the way that we do a little bit more of here in the United States in our political, religious freedom related advocacy. Additionally, we saw it in the last administration where the Anti-Semitism Envoy's Office signed MOUs with important institutions in Morocco and in Bahrain, actually, but on these similar issues of combating both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Part of the issue here as well is that while coalition building is great, it's sort of an intermediary step, right? Because ultimately it only matters so much if you can go to synagogue and not worry about your synagogue being attacked, right? So the physical security really needs to come first and foremost in those cases where it's lacking. But at the same time, building both partnership for civil liberties and freedom of worship can be very productive across various communities in Europe. But additionally, Chair Manchin, when you were talking about the rising awareness of the problem of anti-Semitism, one of the challenges of anti-Semitism in Europe is that many of the European Muslim communities do have higher levels of anti-Semitic belief in certain anti-Semitic stereotypes, or in higher levels on average of negative attitudes, generally speaking, towards Jewish people. This is one of the results from ADL's Global 100 polls, including in 2019 for select countries. But we also find that over time, those levels of attitudes go down among European Muslim communities, either because of interaction with Jewish communities or in terms of seeing shared values or shared interests, or perhaps visiting a Holocaust site, for example. So it's not to say that it's a perennial or inherent issue, but building understanding and collaboration across those lines can have constructive long-term benefits, ideally for both communities, but also US interests as well.
We have time for one final question from a Jewish association in Poland saying they're implementing the comprehensive Jewish community hate crime and hate speech monitoring, data collecting and reporting system in Poland. In the meantime, they're working on the IRA working definition implementation in Poland. Their project goal is to raise awareness of and advocate for the adoption of the IRA working definition. So they're asking you all, do you have any recommendations for a civil society organization to implement such an important project during such political challenges that they're facing in Poland?
I think at the most basic level in Poland, what the public figures need to do is stop digging the hole deeper. I think if there was greater outrage about public anti-Semitism in Poland, that would reassure the Polish Jewish community more than anything else, because that is their major complaint. The Polish Jewish community thankfully has not suffered from any serious physical attacks on its institutions, but the atmosphere that is generated by political parties that openly use anti-Semitic rhetoric is oppressive on that community. It makes them very nervous, and that's the thing that I think firstly needs to be addressed in Poland.
Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we've reached the end of our hour, and we'll have to conclude for today. I want to thank the audience members who asked the questions. Couldn't get to them all, but thanks for that. And I'd like to thank both of our commissioners leading the conversation today, Chair Gayle Manchin and Commissioner Gary Bauer, for this very timely issue, obviously, and something that we'll be following on very closely. And of course, to our expert panelists, Mr. Andrew Srulevitch and Dr. David Weinberg, for their outstanding report and for sharing their expertise and insights. I also want to thank particularly Zach Uden, USCIRF's researcher who covers anti-Semitism for the Commission, for all of his work on the report and event, as well as Danielle Ashbahian and Nina Ulam from our outreach team for their work on the event and report. If you'd like to learn more about USCIRF's work on anti-Semitism, you can always visit our website at www.uscirf.gov. We look forward to hosting similar conversations on other countries and issues in the weeks and months ahead. Thanks for tuning in today, and we'll see you next time on USCIRF's Conversation.
And Dwight, if I can just jump in, I want to encourage people to watch the report launch event next week when you all are unveiling your important annual report as well.
Good point. Thanks for that plug, as Chair Manchin did early. But yes, a week from today, we certainly will be releasing our 2021 annual report. So come back for that. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great day.